Now we're very excited to have Deborah Gillis with us this morning. She is the president and CEO of Catalyst New York, who will talk about what the issues are here in the United States. Deborah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I must say, after listening to Kristin's presentation, I think we here in the US have a lot to learn from Iceland. I really suspect that as the conversation this morning goes on, that we're going to hear more than perspectives on gender equality, the progress we've made, the challenges that remain. We're also going to hear about the motivation, the passion that drives the men and women on this stage to become champions of women's empowerment. Some of us, I think, come to this work and this issue because we understand the compelling data and link between women in leadership and the financial performance of companies. We understand that this is a talent imperative for organizations. Some of us are motivated by personal experience, by the aspirations that we might have for our daughters or nieces or friends. All of these are true for me. I'll share one aha moment that probably led me in many ways to be on this stage. My very first job post-college, I was at a large gathering. The leader of the organization I was working for was standing at the front of the room giving a talk. A woman walked in a side door and kind of quietly took a seat at the back of the room. My boss paused and said, "Where did that secretary go? I need a glass of water." And there was kind of a hush in the room. And one brave man raised his hand and he said, "Well, actually, she's an international trade lawyer who's argued before the Supreme Court of Canada." And he said, "Oh, it's so difficult these days. The secretaries look like lawyers and the lawyers look like secretaries." It was the first moment of my life where I realized that someone would look at me and just by the fact I was a woman might make assumptions about my capabilities or my aspirations or what my contribution might be. And that's why I know everyone in this room today is here, because we all understand that that's a loss. When those aspirations, assumptions are made about women and their talents and what they can contribute, it's a loss for companies, it's a loss for business, it's a loss for society, it's a loss for countries. And so we really need to focus on these issues. And in fact, it was really that link between women in work, social progress, and economic competitiveness that makes Catalyst's vision, changing workplaces, changing lives, as relevant today as it was more than 50 years ago when Catalyst was founded here in the US. By Felice Schwartz. Felice was a visionary. She didn't just see a weakened labor force in the United States. She saw, in her words, an opportunity to bring to our country's needs the unused capacities of educated women who want to combine family and work. Very true today as it was then. And while a lot has changed for women, and for Catalyst since 1962 when we were founded, a lot remains the same. We now work in many countries around the world. We have offices in Canada, Europe, India, and Australia, and in May we will launch our operations in Japan. And we work with more than 700 companies on a global basis to help them develop strategies to build inclusive cultures and environments where women and men equally can contribute to success. We understand that the status of women varies by country and region, but at their core, there are some similar issues that must be addressed if we're going to see progress happen. Kristín shared some really important statistics for us on what's happening in Iceland and what has contributed to Iceland being named at the top of the Global Gender Gap Report. She was far too polite to remind us or point out that here in the US, we were 23rd on that list. Or that in Canada, where I grew up, that we were 20th on that list. And so part of what I want to do is share what are some of the reasons behind women's underrepresentation in leadership in the US, just in the same way that she shared some of what's contributed to the success that we've seen in Iceland. I'll speak first about women on boards. She talked about legislation that requires 40% of each gender to be represented on boards. I really like the fact that it's each gender because it takes the debate away from being about women to being about diversity of thought and perspective and experience, which makes, I think, the buy-in a lot easier to achieve. We've seen other approaches. Of course, the quota legislation has been in place in several countries in Europe. We've also seen other approaches in countries like Australia and Canada and the UK, where comply or explain disclosure models are starting to have an impact in terms of the momentum shift and advancing women to leadership. What has that meant here in the United States, and where do we see women on boards? According to Catalyst's 2013 census of women board directors in Fortune 500 companies, women hold 16.9% of board seats, and we're stalled, quite frankly. Those numbers have remained essentially unchanged for 8 consecutive years. And so we've got work to do. And one thing we can certainly learn from Iceland and other countries is that the strategy that we pick may be different. What's really important is that we act and move forward with intention. That's why Catalyst has been putting forward a solution that we call the Catalyst Corporate Board Resource. Since we launched the Corporate Board Resource, which is a directory of CEO-sponsored women whose CEOs are prepared to say, I know this woman, I've worked with her, she is ready to serve on a corporate board. We've launched that, and what's been not a surprise to us is frankly how easy it was to find these women, because one of the great myths that exists about the issue of women's representation on boards is that this is a supply problem. How often have I heard a leader say to me, I'd love to have a woman on my board, but I can't find one? It's simply not true. When we look at the executive ranks of Fortune companies, we see more than 700 women executives. The problem is not where we're looking. The problem is, it's where we're looking, not that there aren't women available. And in fact, our research shows that 80% of vacant board seats are filled by men. So where are we looking? That's why I'm really excited about the Catalyst Corporate Board Resource, because it combines the sponsorship of CEOs with really qualified women and really dispels the myth that women don't have the skills and they aren't there to serve on those roles. If we look at the executive ranks, the pipeline to the CEO jobs, the pipeline in many cases to the boardroom, US women hold 14.6% of executive officer positions. Again, we're largely stalled. Those numbers haven't changed in about 4 years. More than 25% of Fortune 500 companies have 0 women executive officers, and women are leading less than 5% of Fortune 500 companies. Now, quite frankly, when I share these numbers in the media interviews, when we release these studies, or in conversations that we have, I often get a lot of pushback. And it typically comes back to, well, this is essentially women's fault. It is about the choices that women make. It's about how women manage their careers. It's about all the things that women don't do, which really fails to get at the core issues of what's happening in organizations. I think it was so interesting to hear Kristín say, we've created a model that assumes there are 2 people working. We continue largely to exist with a model that was based on some world that we're not familiar with anymore, where women stayed at home and looked after families and men were breadwinners. We need to move on to really reflect the reality. And so when we fall back to those old notions of it's women's fault, we're ignoring the reality of those cultural societal, systemic issues that are taking place in organizations. So part of what Catalyst has done is really try to get underneath women's underrepresentation in leadership and say, well, what's going on here? And to challenge some of those assumptions or myths that exist. The first one that I like to challenge is the myth of the glass ceiling. And I don't mean that to say that there isn't a glass ceiling. Clearly the numbers tell us that there is. But what we've gotten in our heads is that women advance, everything is fine until we hit that point. When in fact, the research shows that in job one, from day one, women start at a lower level and are paid less than men. And this is based on research that we've done looking at MBA graduates, men and women, from the leading business schools around the world. So it's not that we hit that point at a certain stage in our careers, we start there. And because we start there, that also means that the gap widens over time. So when we explain that data, then we get the pushback that says, oh, well, it's because women have children. And in fact, when we look at that sample of high potential business leaders, even with men and women who don't have children, the same finding holds. And so then it becomes, well, it's because women don't do the right things to advance their careers. They don't negotiate salary, they don't ask the right questions, they don't adopt the right strategies. And again, what our research shows that even for the most ambitious group of those MBA grads, when men and women adopt the same strategies to advance their careers, men get more payoff, more promotions, more career advancement, better increases in pay. The other issues that we see, and so there clearly is in this that even in adopting those strategies, it doesn't work as effectively for men, or for women as it does for men. Others see the gap and say, well, the issue then is it's an ambition gap. Women don't aspire to those jobs. And women don't care about money. Raise your hands if that's true. We care. And we'll talk about the pay gap later. But there's something really important in this finding that I think those of you who work in organizations should pay some attention to. We called it hot jobs. And when we looked at that high potential group of employees, what we saw is that men and women get different opportunities. Even when organizations are focused on investing in talent development, men are more likely than women to get access to mission-critical roles. Those projects and assignments that have larger budgets, larger teams, more visibility to senior executives in their companies, the kinds of projects that we all know are really important to the organization. And in being in those roles and having visibility to leadership, men are then in a position to get the kind of sponsorship that they need to advance their careers. Even, and we see this in the research, when women indicate a willingness to relocate for their job, they are less likely to be asked whether they would take an international assignment. And again, what we see in the data is that assumptions are made and women aren't asked and given the opportunity to say no. Choices are made for women in that sense by excluding them from being able to make that decision for themselves. Underneath all of this are clearly some systemic issues that organizations need to focus on if we're going to achieve the kind of gender equality that we want to see both here in our country and in organizations and countries around the world. Businesses need to put strategies in place that acknowledge that these challenges exist. If there's one thing we've learned from more than 50 years of history in this country, is that these issues won't take care of themselves. For a very long time, there was a belief that as women are better educated, as they're in our labor force, they will naturally rise to the top. That's the myth of the meritocracy. Because if we truly had meritocracies in all of our organizations, if these barriers and issues didn't exist, then we should expect to see women proportionately represented at the bottom and the middle and the top of organizations, and we don't. That's what the data tells us. And so what we need to do is see leaders and organizations do the kinds of things that we heard about this morning. Strategies that clearly put women at the core of business initiatives that say advancing talent in my organization, all talent fairly and equally is critical not only to the success of my business, but is the right thing to do for the country I live in, for the communities in which we live, and for families as well. To do that, I think we need to broaden the agenda to talk about the kinds of issues that we'll address in our panel: access to daycare, who does the work at home. We heard that from Kristín earlier. Those important issues are also part of the puzzle, as is the clear link to the gender pay gap. I shared with a couple of people earlier, and we'll have a chance to talk about this, that when I talked about the gender pay gap recently on TV, I got what I'd essentially call hate mail coming in saying, there's no such thing. This doesn't exist. There is a link between these issues. And what Catalyst research shows, in fact, is that in that first job post-MBA, women earn on average $4,600 a year less than men. That then increases over time. Why does it matter? It matters because if women are paid what they deserve fairly and equitably, then they have money to contribute to the economy, to spend, to help businesses grow. It also means that families are better off. This is an issue that's important for our success individually, for families, for communities, for business, and for countries. And I think we have a lot to learn from some of the agenda that we heard shared with Iceland. And I hope as we continue the conversation that we can talk more about what we can do together. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Just as we set up the chairs, I'll give my little intro now about what we're doing at Bloomberg. I am editor-at-large of global women's coverage at Bloomberg. I've been a reporter who covered Wall Street and a senior writer at Bloomberg Markets magazine, which is a finance magazine. And I covered Wall Street for about 15 years, and over that time, it was certainly clear that a lot of the people I talked to were guys. Then the financial crisis came along, and those of us at Bloomberg who were really covering that as our story, as really understanding what was going on in the markets, among regulators, among investors, among people who run countries, people who run companies. We emerged from that period very aware that almost all of the 5,000 stories we do a day at Bloomberg were filled with men with very few women. So a few years ago, precisely in 2010, Matt Winkler, who's our editor-at-large, who's our editor-in-chief, made me an editor-at-large and said, go forth and figure out how to better infuse all of Bloomberg journalism with women, with understanding the role of women as actors in the global economy. And I'm very, very delighted to tell you that we have a women's initiative that now involves 2,000 journalists at Bloomberg in 150 bureaus in 70 countries. And I talk about this all the time. My job is really as a consultant to kind of everyone in the news organization to figure out where the women are on their beats, to write about them now or later. You don't have to do stories just because the woman happens to be a woman. You need to find where these people are growing and developing in their businesses and write about them in the context of your news beat. And in this project, we have had an amazing opportunity to break news, to get to know more people, and to really enhance Bloomberg News and show where the women are and how vital they are to a healthy global economy. And certainly the Iceland piece of it is so interesting because, as we know, after the country's difficulties during the financial crisis, a lot of women moved into the fore as leaders both of the country and also of banks and creating investment companies and other other entities that sort of contributed to the redevelopment and the renewal of the Icelandic economy. And I think it's really a microcosm for what could be happening around the world now, with leaders like Christine Lagarde, perhaps Hillary Clinton running for president. All of these things are coming forward, and as a news organization, we really see the need to follow these stories and to incorporate them into all of our journalism. So one last thing I'm just going to say about that is that we don't have a women's team. We are different from other news organizations who have tended to say, well, women are an issue, so let's find a woman, let's hire some women, let's make a reporting team and cover the women. We have very clearly decided not to do that, because we think that it's really part of the global story, and we don't want to in any way separate women out from the rest of our reporting. So I remain a team of one. Anyway, with that said, I'd like to invite Deborah and Kirsten and Gréta up to the stage, and So I want to start with just saying that this kind of conversation, which engages a U.S. audience, Scandinavian U.S. audience, perhaps there are people from other places here as well. This is a particularly important discussion because we are in fact able to compare, or have the resources here to compare Iceland, which is number one on the WEF, in the WEF report, with what happens here in the United States. And this is also an opportunity for us to learn from each other, and I think that's it's really terrific to be here. So I want to start with the thing that's very compelling to me, and I'm going to say also as an aside, there's an irony here that the people representing the American point of view here happen to both be Canadian. So the stealth foreigners.
I didn't know that.
I'm Canadian also, so here we are.
We're taking over the world.
We are taking over the world. I'm interested in particular in the child care issue, and in how the U.S., you can look at where it ranks on the WEF index overall of the global gender gap, but really one, hugely interesting statistic about the United States is that it is one of only 3 countries in the world that doesn't provide pay when you have a baby, as a legislated, maternity pay. So if you work for the federal government right now and you have a baby tomorrow, the day after your baby's born, you might have some sick leave pay that you can take, but you basically don't get any maternity benefit. And that is something that comes forward in a lot of policy discussion among women, but doesn't seem to have much traction in larger policy discussions in the United States. Let us talk about child care, and Deborah, what is holding back the U.S. with regard to from learning from the Scandinavian countries, including Iceland, on what a great benefit it is to a growing economy to, take care of new parents, take care of children, and to get them, to get these households, to give the households the kind of support they need to really have a vibrant labor force.
Well, thanks for the question. So as the Canadian also on the panel, I feel not an expert in this area. I've just moved to New York 2 months ago, so you'll have to bear with me. But I think the simple answer to that question comes back to something that Kristín said about thinking about Iceland considering changing the model to, what did you say you were looking at, 5, 5, and 2? And the reason that didn't happen is because it's really expensive. I suspect that what's behind the child care issue and not moving forward with it in a substantive way is that it's an expensive investment to make. The problem with that is the link between all of these issues that we've talked about. And if women don't have access to affordable, reliable daycare, then choices get made about the work that they do and whether they can invest in their careers and what that means for their families. And as you said, there really is no comprehensive system of childcare in the United States. About 60% of funding for childcare comes directly from parents. And so again, that comes back to choices. And if women are paid less than men, what does that mean for them? Here in New York, for example, some of the stats show that for married couples in New York, the cost of center-based care for a 4-year-old is on average 14% of their median incomes. For single-parent families, and that would often be families that were led by mothers, in New York, the cost of center-based care for a 4-year-old is on average 48% of the median income. So think about what that means for women's ability to engage in the labor force. And again, if you tie that back to the pay gap issue, it's pretty significant. One of my colleagues shared with me that when she was looking for care for her 2-year-old, she was looking on Craigslist for childcare options. And she saw a posting from someone, I just want to read it to you. Seeking daycare for my 2-year-old while I work. I can't pay more than $20 a day. That also gets to issues around the quality of childcare that's available to working mothers who just can't afford the kind of quality care that a mother or father would want for their kids. So this is a really important issue that ties, I think, to all of these things that we're talking about. The pay gap, women's ability to engage fully in the workforce, what that means for families, and ultimately, if women are being left out of the labor force because of the strain financially that childcare puts on them, then how are we building the talent of men and women in organizations that can then contribute to the success of companies?
Kristín, Gréta.
No, I'm just thinking a lot when I listen to you, because it's also the nature of society is different. I mean, I think back home, it is normal for us to look to the government, to look to the municipality, and if the issue is of common concern to all of us, that the government or the municipality actually finances, you know, the schools or the kindergartens or what have you. I mean, and that is different when you look at the nature of our societies. And so this is something, I think there is an agreement back home, this is something that should be provided by either, you know, the government or the municipalities. And we are willing to participate in financing that as taxpayers.
Certainly the reputation of Scandinavia in general is that it's a socialist place where you get long parental care and your children get taken care of. But you know, in the U.S., I think that seems that reputation seems problematic, and people perhaps don't realize just what a huge benefit it has been economically to Iceland. Maybe you can address that, Kristín.
Yeah, exactly. This agreement between the government, the municipalities, and the people is because I think that everyone realizes that this is how important it is. It's so important for the economy, and it's important for the development of society. But I would like to stress that we have to get away from this that childcare is women's responsibility.
I agree.
It is. It's the family's responsibility. You know, if there is, well, depending on what kind of family, and it's so important to take a look at the whole picture. And this question of childcare is not only important in the United States, it's very much discussed inside the European Union. Because what's happening is that the fertility rate is going down. People are getting older. I mentioned this in my talk. This is going to be if people choose not to have children or have only one child because the system is not supportive to the families, and this is what will happen. And I have read, I don't know the problem that in Japan, young women, they choose not to marry because the tradition is if you get married, you go home. And they choose not to marry. And this means that the fertility rate is going down. And you know, family values changing and all of that. So what I'm saying is it's so important to look at the whole picture. Women are there. They are very well educated, in general, very well educated. And if society is not using these human resources, it's bad. It's bad for the future. It's bad for the economy.
I would echo that comment very much, and it may go back to your original question of why we haven't seen more progress on the issue. If we talk about this issue as a women's issue, then that may be part of the barrier that we need to get over. We need to talk about this as a business and societal issue that's important to our economy, and not have it kind of segregated as a women's issue only, because it's not, clearly.
But as you say, because of the gender pay gap,
Yeah.
it's the women who, that's a fact.
Yeah.
I
We
do
need to
want to
change
make a
that.
point, and this is something that is along the lines of what we've been doing at Bloomberg, that in Japan, since you mentioned it, there's a woman called Matsui, who's a Goldman Sachs, the only woman partner of Goldman Sachs in Asia now. And she grew up in California, but she's Japanese. She's in Tokyo. She wrote a report in 1999 called Womenomics that was put out by Goldman that really examined how the Japanese economy can address the aging population issues by engaging women of childbearing age to get them back into the labor force. 15 years later, Abe has actually started having his folks read the Womenomics arguments and the policy positions of Abe's government in terms of reviving the Japanese economy at now precisely listen to some of these things that Kathy Matsui wrote about. She is now an advisor to the Japanese government, and they have actually included a big increase in both money and government attention on how to create better child care in Japan. So, that's not a US story, but that is something that is being seen by a country that hasn't paid too much attention to these issues as being very relevant, and that's going on right now. So maybe there is more discussion about this coming forward in other places, because they do make the economic argument. Because we keep mentioning the pay gap, and I want to make sure that we get some time to talk about that. Kirsten, I saw a video clip of you on YouTube where you were talking a little bit about the Iceland being #1 in the gender sphere on the WEF report. But one of the things that you said still has not been really addressed adequately in Iceland is the gender pay gap. Maybe you have more to say about that, why that is, and what needs to happen in your community, and maybe what we can learn from in terms of what Iceland's doing.
Well, actually, in Iceland, we have a report after report, committee after committee, going through this, trying to find ways to bridge the gender pay gap, but very little has happened. Now, there is this new standard. It's kind of an international standard that has to be recognized as a standard. And the companies are going to, this is just the beginning, and you have to go, it's a little bit like Jon described this morning. You have to go through the situation in your company, and you have to fulfill this standard. You have to show that there is equal pay for equal work, and it is the beginning that each company goes through the situation inside.
And Icelandic companies are adopting this?
Yeah, it's just beginning. It's the problem is that it's quite complicated. It's quite complicated. But both companies and the ministries and some public institutions are going to adopt this or implement this standard. It will be. It has been tried somewhere in the world, but this is quite new, and it would be interesting to see. At the same time, the government is running a plan on bridging the gender pay gap and connecting to the reconciliation of family and work, and because this, of course, you have to look at the whole picture. What needs to be done? What can we do to encourage people to share work in the home more equally, and so on. But as I mentioned, these are very old, old and deep structures, and very fixed in our heads that men need to have better salaries than women, better wages than women.
When I saw the graph where it really hasn't changed, that was really very telling because so many graphs show you some change. So a graph with no change
Yeah.
is fascinating. I was wondering, because I don't know, is there a union issue around sort of wage, constant wages or higher wages in Iceland? I don't know how it works there, but are some of these jobs that men are in by nature higher paying jobs because they are union jobs?
Yeah, I think we
And
can say that, yes.
women
yeah.
don't break into those
or they
categories of activity?
Yeah, and vice versa. It's,
Right.
Men are not entering the, for example, the health sector or parts of the health sector. Women are totally dominating in the preschools and in secondary schools and primary schools, and so it's also is connected to this very gender segregated labor market.
Right.
This reflects in both ways. But I think we can say that some groups are stronger than others traditionally, and I often say that the wage in Iceland is kind of a step, and that it's impossible to if you're in this step and someone approaches you, you have to go to the next. Very, very difficult to change this hierarchy or what we should call it.
And Deborah, even at the most senior roles or people advancing into senior roles coming out of MBA school,
Absolutely.
not regular, why is this such a sticky situation in the US legislatively? Why is it so hard for people to accept that there is a problem and that maybe we should talk about it?
Well, I don't know. I think it probably is partly, we've been talking about these issues for so long, we kind of assume that things are fair and equal. For example, when Catalyst released our research that showed this gap for women and men MBAs starting at $4,600 annually, there were members of our board who, when we shared the findings, said, no, this can't be true. Not in my company. We hire out of university and college. People go into the same bands. They're paid the same, et cetera, et cetera. Can't be true. There's something wrong with this data. And we said, no. Even when you control for all of the things I talked about earlier, the finding holds. The next board meeting, we came back, and one of the board members said, I want to share something with everyone else. After the last meeting, I went back to my team and I said, Catalyst says that there's a gap in pay for women and men in companies. Take a look at ours. Go back and look for the last 3 months at how we hired. And what he said was, they took a look, they found a gap, there was a difference between what men and women were being paid. They couldn't explain to me why that was, so I told them to fix it. So I think there's kind of an assumption that people are, well-intentioned and that we don't make these kinds of decisions that have different impact for men and women. That's maybe why it's difficult to get at the issue. But as I said earlier, when the Paycheck Fairness Act was before the Senate and there was lots of conversation and the president had talked about this issue, and I did some media around the pay gap, and I got tons of emails saying there's no such thing and other research shows there's no pay gap and it's not true. And the data's there. If you look at the census statistics, it says women earn 77 cents for every dollar that men make. It's 23 cents. Then there are others saying, no, it's not actually 23 cents. If you control for all these choices that women make, it's actually 16 or 19 cents. Well, as if 16 or 19 cents is okay.
Right.
It's not 23, it's really 16, so we don't have a problem. So, there's really an issue here.
Gréta, I want to ask you, at the UN, there's obviously a whole different slate of issues. You represent Iceland here. You are at the UN as a representative of the country that is the most equal in terms of gender. A big part of this discussion tends to also be how do we engage men. I will share, I was earlier this week at the Milken conference in California, and we have been organizing this panel since October to try and spur discussion around women as actors in the global economy and how we cover them in the media. We had this amazing panel set up, and I was sure that if we did it at the Milken conference, which is like 80% men, that we'd have a room full of men because they'd be terribly interested. And it was a fantastic panel. I urge you to look at it on YouTube, but I was a little disappointed that when it came down to it, the room filled with women and everyone was nodding in agreement. And it's very, very hard to engage more men in these issues, and particularly to have men in places like the UN perhaps, or in high levels of business really get it. What is your experience with regard to how to kind of break open the discussion on better gender equality?
Well, I mean, from where we are coming from, I mean, Iceland is that women's rights are human rights. I mean, it is, you know, how we are discussing it now is more, you know, sort of from a practical point of view and so on. But in the end, women and men are equal and should be treated equal, and there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex. So this is always our starting point, that this is a human rights issue. If we need to present this as smart economics, we are willing to go along with that. But we will never, ever forget that this is a human rights issue, first and foremost. And you know, and I really liked, I mean, when you were saying this guy that spoke up about the woman that came into the room, I mean, because in a way it is necessary also to create this culture around women's rights, just as with racism, for example. I mean, racism is not just a matter of concern to people of color, it's a matter of concern to all of us. And the same should apply to women's rights. Mm-hmm. So for example, to talk about the necessity to speak up, like when we are talking about other human rights issues. And I think it's a good sort of way to sell the idea to treat women and men equally is to present it as good economics. I mean, and for our country, for example, I don't know how we would get by without women on the workforce. I mean, that wouldn't work. But we are really, I mean, at the UN we talk about the role of men and boys. I mean, that is very much what we talk about. But the how is the challenge. And UN Women has just come up with a campaign, He for She, and it can be found on the website heforshe.org. And that is an initiative that they have taken to try to put this at, you know, higher on the agenda and to get everybody engaged, both at the UN and you know, on a global scale. But from, you know, and from the Icelandic point of view, we will be celebrating Beijing +20, the Women's Conference in Beijing next year, and it will start this year at the UN, and our focus will very much be on the role of men and boys in general, and in particular on violence against women, because you have to engage men. I mean, we cannot solve certain problems without the engagement of men, and you cannot have gender equality if both genders aren't involved. I mean, it goes without saying. But I think one of the measures that I am very fond of is gender mainstreaming, because it's not very politically sexy to talk about gender mainstreaming, but it really is important to not only talk about gender equality and women's empowerment when we are discussing those issues only. We need to discuss these issues everywhere, in disarmament, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to the environment, climate change.
So just to be clear, gender mainstreaming is the idea of having gender be part of the discussion on every other topic.
On every,
right.
How does the salary policy of USSR, for example, affect men? How does it affect women? I mean, you know, when you at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, when we make policy on a certain issue, how does it actually affect men and how does it affect women? I mean, this is the way to do it. So we are very keen on incorporating gender in every single field that we are discussing.
So when did you come to the U.S. for the UN? You've been here
3 years ago.
3 years
but it's
ago?
my second time around.
Right. So what is different now in your experience on these issues compared with when you first came? Has it changed?
It has changed, and it unfortunately has not changed a lot. I mean, I really noticed there is a difference in the sense that member states discuss gender and women's empowerment much more than they did. And we have UN Women, which is a new entity at the UN that is really supposed to highlight these issues and keep all of us accountable to the standards that we have agreed upon. But still, there are extremely difficult and sensitive issues such as sexual and reproductive health and rights, for example, that we have endless discussions about at the UN. And also, in general, I mean, we have member states coming up with, when we are trying to agree on common conclusions, they will come up with the notion of having a paragraph on sovereignty. So they want to be able to opt out if whatever we agree upon is not in line with their national legislation or the interpretation of religion and so on, then they want to be able to opt out. But this is not so much when we are, discussing other things.
Because I was going to say,
Yeah.
so with the women's legislation, it's all fine, but they want to be able to tick the box, we've decided not to do this.
Yeah, on particular issues, yes.
But with other human rights issues, they don't have that choice.
No, not really. I mean, it's not a choice. I mean, they will try to argue for this, but like we had this discussion in March during the negotiations in the Commission on the Status of Women, but fortunately there is no paragraph on sovereignty there. We managed to reach an agreement. And also, I mean, just to demonstrate how these issues, I mean, how difficult they are for the member states to reach agreements. I mean, there are two issues where we are, at the UN until 4 o'clock in the morning or even until 7 o'clock the next morning, negotiating disarmament and women's issues.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, and that sort of shows you how difficult they are.
Right.
I mean, because this really brings you to the core of societies and all the sensitivities around the traditions and religion and where we all are coming from.
And what is fair?
And so when people say soft issues like human rights and women's rights and so on, I mean, I'm not buying into that.
Well, on that note, let me ask, we have a few minutes left. I would love to take some questions. I don't know if we have a microphone or we should just speak up. Oh, you've got a loud voice. Maybe you could stand up, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mika Mosbacher. I'm the Honorary Consul General of Iceland in Texas. And this conversation and dialogue is fascinating, and I really wanted to thank Leonard and Jean for bringing us together. One observation with the dialogue is, and this is a problem I feel within our women's issues in general, is that there should be a man on the panel. We should be engaging men in these discussions so that it doesn't become us against them. And that to me is the most important element that we must look to in terms of resolving some of these issues and moving forward. Thank you.
That is certainly a challenge. Yes?
Hi, I'm Beth Raisen. I've been a lawyer. I've run a nonprofit for girls in underserved communities in New York City. And I was the first women's studies major at the University of Virginia starting in 1976, a long time ago. And two comments I have that you might want to expound on. One is when I was starting to do my research 3 decades ago, this issue of professions that women started to move into becoming undervalued economically was very prevalent, and it looks like that trend has not changed. I was particularly struck by your graph, which showed the number of women, the percentage of women getting higher education as compared to men, and yet you still have this income differential. Traditionally, we've thought higher education means higher income. But the other issue that comes to mind is the issue of power, two issues, power and money, right? So I think one of the underpinnings that ties into this is people in power don't like to give up their power, and people who have money don't like to give up their money. And so we're seeing that politically. For example, yesterday in the Senate, the legislation to increase the minimum wage, which disproportionately affects women in this country was not able to get to a vote for approval, and one has to wonder why that is. We see the increasing differential economically between the highest paid executives and baseline workers. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this issue of power and money. It's been addressed at one level in Iceland with legislation that has moved women into positions of legislative power, but certainly here in the US, this drive for shareholder value and profit seems to also be an underpinning of this issue around equal rights for women. Because if you can pay them less, you can make more money.
I think it might be a good question for Deborah, given that the members of the board of Catalyst are a long list of very senior men in American business. Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon, they're on the board. So you have a certain dialogue, this dialogue going with senior men. How does that play out for you? Are there things that are they universally supportive because here I am at a Catalyst board meeting, or is there some sense that they need to be, how do you steer, wealthy men in power on these issues?
Well, that's an interesting question. So you asked specifically about our board and some of the leaders that we have the great opportunity to work with. And I would say they're around our boardroom tables and participating in the events that we hold for many of the reasons we've talked about here today. They understand that if their businesses are going to be successful, they need to engage and advance women talent and men talent, that this really is a talent imperative for them. And they do, to the point that was just made, they really link their strategies around women's advancement in their organizations to their business strategy. It is a business imperative, and so they come to the table with that perspective in mind. And I think part of what value they have in engaging with us is understanding what works, what doesn't, what the challenges are. There are often some aha moments because there are also women CEOs around that table who are able to share their perspective as a woman coming up through the ranks of business. And so there's learning and engagement that happens. And that's part of why we bring them together. So that they can then make change. And the other reason why they're important is because we've done research that looks at the issue of engaging men as champions in this diversity work. And one of the things that we see is that when men understand that there's unfairness, that's a motivator for them. And in particular, when men see other men acting as role models and engaging, it almost gives them courage and permission to become engaged in this as well. So the male role models are really, really important to moving this forward. I would say we've got to move beyond conversations to the point that said we're all women talking about this. The language that we use excludes men. If we say we're having an event to talk about women on boards, who do we think is going to show up? Women, not men. So in some, and I say that, kind of flippantly to say, when we use the word gender, who are we talking about? We're talking about women, because men don't have gender. It's just women. So we have to be inclusive in our language as well and what we talk about, because this isn't an issue about women. It's an issue about the health and growth and vibrancy of businesses and economies and families and communities. And unless we start to talk about it in that way, men aren't going to feel that it's a conversation for them to be part of.
So I need a guy to ask a question. Yes.
Someone has to ask the question. No, I think it's very important to remember that, this debate becomes very often very boring because it's women against men. And it's boring. It comes down to it's really simple, for me at least. It's fairness. And it's not about women against men are not fairness. every individual in the world should have equal rights.
Right,
That's the first one. So take the gender out of it.
right.
It's generally that. And secondly, it absolutely makes economical sense. And we have to use the talent pool of everyone. If we exclude women, if we exclude races that are different from us, we cut out a lot of talent pool. And if you look at it from a perspective of an organization, county, or wherever, you're losing out, and you will lose out. And if you turn the debate into that one, then it becomes exciting. Then we are not looking at, it's not like an old-time labor discussion, who's get what. We are all we are increasing the care. We are not dividing it. And that's my point.
I agree.
Now there's one guy that.
But your point's really important because we need to move beyond the conversation that says women's advancement is bad for men. It's a zero-sum game, when in fact it's a win-win-win for men, for women, for companies, for countries, etc.
Yes.
I'm from Scotland here today, and we're just about to consider whether or not to put the 40% quota for our boards. But I also sit here today as a mother of 2 daughters and 2 sons. And it seems to me what's really important is the moves that you've made in childcare. Because if children, why wait till people are 40 and 50 to start engaging them in some of these issues, when actually we're trying to repair the damage that we did when they were children in terms of downgrading the jobs that women do. So I think we can't afford, when we say it's too expensive to look at the childcare issue, we can't afford not to look at the childcare issue, because we're spending all the effort trying to rework the wrongs that were done in the early years.
Interesting point.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having this panel. I'm Francesca Burak, and I'm the local president of Business and Professional Women International. We're in 100 countries around the world. We've done work with the UN on the women's empowerment principles. And for me, I'm looking at this whole issue of transparency. A lot of times, women do not know who gets what, when, and where in terms of pay. So in New York State, Cuomo has developed the Women's Equality Act, which takes care of a lot of issues that we're discussing today. Unfortunately, the Assembly passed it, but the Senate did not. So I would like to know from Gréta, what's going on in Iceland in terms of transparency and everyone being able to view wages and who's earning what, and comparisons not only with gender, but with experience and also the type of job responsibilities. And Deborah, I'm wondering if this is a discussion that's going on with your board, and is there any hope going on there? Thank you.
I think Gréta, you can answer, but I think she meant Kristín, but
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
fine.
it's okay.
Oops. That's fine.
Well, it's difficult to answer your question. I think that through all these projects that I have been mentioning, you know, the goal is to make the whole system transparent, and so that you have the right information, and this equal pay standard. It's supposed to be open. You can look at it. You can look how the companies are doing. But I cannot say. But may I just
You know what
short
I'm going
comment?
to do, just because I'm getting a sort of a signal. We probably need to go to our break very shortly. Why don't we'll just do a lightning round last comment. Deborah, why don't we start with you? Is there, although you have given us so much great information, but in your role, newly taking over Catalyst, newly being here, when you hear this conversation, what is sort of the immediate goal that comes to mind for you in terms of how to devote our energies to learning from each other and sort of expanding the conversation that way?
Yeah, I think there's lots to learn from each other. That's a starting point. We need partnership and collaboration. But I think the common message from all of us is that we need to link all of these issues together because they are all tied together. These are not women's issues. These are fundamental issues that are about business. They're about human rights. They're about the health of and innovation and growth of countries and economies and businesses. And if we can frame the conversation in those ways so that people see those relationships, then we can move forward.
Great. And Kristín?
Yeah, I just want to say finally that in my eyes, this debate is not about women against men. It's about women and men. It's about our society, how we can improve it. And I think information, statistics like this, this is, we need to analyze. We need to know how the situation is in our society. This is something that is very important to cast a light on what we are doing, how are we progressing, and so on. And the ideal world would be that it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, black or white or gay or whatever. That's the ideal world, but that's not how it is. And we have to have in mind that there's still and there always has been resistance. There was resistance against women having the right to vote, and there is still resistance, as you were describing, and good that you mentioned it, this growing hate speech and hate mails, which are extremely worrying. You stand up, you say something important, and you get this over you.
Right.
And it's because it's so dangerous because it's the individual. It's against the individual. You cannot stand up. It's limiting your freedom of speech.
Right.
So that's something that's very important to address.
And Gréta, last word to you.
Yeah, I just think, when I was listening especially to Deborah, because, we know the issues back home, but like when you were mentioning the qualifications issue, it just occurred to me, it's always the same issues that all of us are, dealing with, basically. So it's just very helpful to have discussions like we had today. So, but with that...
Well, it sounds like we have to keep talking. Thank you, everyone, I guess we'll take a break now, and thanks again to our guests.